The guard who recovered a shredded letter from Prince Harry. The puzzle he pieced together jigs a crown. The guards were on their usual rounds, walking slowly, scanning the corridors, and ensuring that everything was in its proper place. Among them was James, a young but disciplined guard who had served the royal household for several years. He was familiar with every corner of the palace, every hallway, and every room that he was allowed to enter. He knew that his job was simple in words, but in practice, it required attention, patience, and trust. No one outside these walls could ever understand the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. James had always been proud of his position. To him, it was more than just a job. It was a privilege to protect the royal family, to be a silent witness to history unfolding in the grand halls of the palace. He took his duty seriously. Every glance, every step, and every decision mattered. Even the smallest mistake could be noticed by someone far higher in rank than him. That thought kept him alert, but it also made him cautious. He had learned over the years that in this world, trust was earned, and secrets were not to be spoken aloud. This evening had started like any other. The sun had set hours ago, and the palace had settled into a soft, golden glow from the lamps lining the corridors. The corridors themselves were almost empty, except for the occasional sound of distant footsteps or muffled voices from rooms where important discussions were taking place. James walked steadily, keeping his eyes forward, yet remaining aware of every detail around him. It was during this routine patrol that something unusual caught his attention. In a quiet hallway near one of the private offices, he noticed a small pile of paper fragments near the edge of a desk. At first, he thought it was some discarded documents. The palace staff often left behind old notes, memos, or forms that were no longer needed. But as James stepped closer, he realized that these were no ordinary papers. They were shredded. Tiny pieces of what once had been a complete document were scattered carefully, almost as if someone had been interrupted mid-task. His curiosity piqued. James knelt down to examine the fragments. They were delicate, like thin leaves of autumn, and each piece had parts of words or sentences written in a familiar handwriting. The style was neat and confident, yet personal in a way that formal documents never were. Something about the fragments felt important. The uniformed guard's heart quickened, a subtle mixture of excitement and unease running through him. He had never encountered something like this during his years at the palace. Shredded documents were not uncommon, but finding one that seemed personal and possibly confidential was another matter entirely. Carefully, James began collecting the pieces. He had learned long ago to be gentle with anything that might be delicate or valuable. He placed the shreds into his palm, inspecting each one. A word here, a phrase there. A small emblem on one corner of a fragment caught his eye. It was unmistakable, the royal insignia, faintly printed but visible. This was no ordinary letter. This was something that belonged to the royal family, and possibly even to Prince Harry himself. For a moment, James felt a rush of wonder. To think that he held in his hands pieces of a letter written by a member of the royal family. It was a rare and extraordinary responsibility. He knew immediately that this was not something to show casually to anyone. He also realized that someone might be looking for these pieces, perhaps even the person who had shredded them. This awareness made him cautious. His training reminded him that secrets were sacred in this palace, and that even the smallest breach could have serious consequences. James decided to examine the fragments further, carefully laying them out on a clean surface nearby. He tried to piece them together as if assembling a puzzle. The words began to take shape, though only partially. "I cannot continue," one fragment read. Another said, "Concerns for the family," and yet another had just, "Decision must." The sentences were incomplete, but the tone was clear. This was a message of importance, a letter written with thought and intention. James felt a strange connection with the unknown writer. He imagined Prince Harry sitting at his desk, pen in hand, thinking carefully about each word, and then, for some reason, deciding that the letter should not exist in whole. A sense of responsibility settled over James like a cloak. He knew that what he was holding could not fall into the wrong hands, yet he also felt a deep curiosity about the story behind the fragments. Why was this letter shredded? What was so private that it could not remain intact? And most importantly, what would happen if it were lost forever? The questions raced in his mind, each one more pressing than the last. He decided to take the fragments to a safer location. Quietly, he gathered them, keeping each piece flat and intact. As he walked down the empty corridor, he reflected on the peculiar nature of his duty. Most nights were calm, almost mundane. Tonight, however, he felt as though he had stumbled into a secret that no one else was meant to discover. The thought made his pulse quicken. He reminded himself to stay calm, to follow the rules, and to remain vigilant. Reaching a small, private office that was used by the senior staff for administrative tasks, James spread the fragments across a table. The soft light from the lamp illuminated the delicate paper, making each word and mark clearer. He began to carefully arrange the pieces, trying to match edges and letters. It was a painstaking process, requiring focus and patience. Some pieces fit together easily, while others seemed impossible to place. He adjusted and readjusted, slowly beginning to see parts of sentences emerge. Time passed quickly. The palace was silent except for the quiet shuffling of paper and the occasional creak of the floor beneath his feet. James worked steadily, fully aware that what he was doing required both care and secrecy. His mind was entirely focused on the fragments before him. He felt as though he was on the verge of uncovering something extraordinary, something that had been hidden from everyone else. As he pieced together the fragments, a chilling realization came over him. This was no ordinary note. The words, the handwriting, and the careful destruction of the letter suggested that it was deeply personal. James felt a shiver run down his spine. He had handled confidential documents before, but this felt different. This was intimate, fragile, and vulnerable. In his hands were pieces of a message that someone had chosen to hide, and the responsibility of reconstructing it rested entirely on him. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The weight of what he had discovered pressed heavily on his shoulders. James realized that his ordinary night of guarding the palace had turned into an extraordinary challenge. He felt a mixture of pride, excitement, and nervousness. He was not just a guard anymore. He was a keeper of secrets, a silent witness to something no one outside the palace might ever see. The guard continued working, piecing together what he could, each fragment slowly revealing small parts of the story. He was careful, deliberate, and methodical, aware that one wrong move could ruin the entire puzzle. As the evening deepened into night, James felt a growing connection to the mystery. Each word he reconstructed brought him closer to understanding the thoughts of the writer. Each sentence revealed a hint of concern, a trace of emotion, and a glimpse into the private world of the royal family. Finally, as the first signs of dawn began to creep through the high windows, James leaned back and looked at the fragments he had assembled. Though incomplete, a pattern was emerging. The words hinted at matters of great importance, decisions that weighed heavily on the writer's mind, and feelings that were rarely shared with anyone. James felt a quiet awe. He had never expected to be part of something so personal, so delicate, and so significant. He gathered the fragments carefully, knowing that the next steps would be just as important as the ones he had already taken. There was more to discover, more to piece together, and perhaps more to protect. As he stood and looked out across the quiet palace corridors, he understood that this night had changed something within him. It was no longer just about guarding the palace. It was about being a part of a story that was unfolding, piece by piece, in his hands. And with that thought, James prepared himself for the challenge ahead, unaware that what he had begun tonight would lead him deeper into a mystery that few could ever imagine, and that the puzzle in his hands was only the beginning. James had barely slept that night. Though the palace corridors were quiet and the halls empty, his mind was alive with thoughts of the shredded letter. Every fragment replayed in his memory, every partial word and phrase. He kept turning the image of the fragments over in his mind, imagining how the sentences might complete themselves. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He wasn't just a guard anymore. He was a silent keeper of a secret, and the knowledge that he might be the only one who knew what the letter truly said made him both anxious and determined. Early in the morning, before the palace stirred with its usual bustle, James returned to the small office where he had laid out the fragments the night before. He had brought a clean sheet of paper to take notes, a magnifying glass, and a pencil to mark observations. He spread out the pieces carefully, trying to remember exactly where each one belonged. Some fragments were tiny, almost invisible, yet each held a clue, a piece of the story. He began slowly, starting with the pieces that were easiest to connect. Two fragments with the same handwriting aligned perfectly. The words began to make sense. I cannot continue to ignore, and the responsibilities that weigh on me each day. A shiver ran down James's spine. It was clear that this was a personal letter, written with deep thought and emotion. The tone was serious but vulnerable, as if the writer had opened a door into their private world and allowed someone else to glimpse it. As he worked, James found another piece with part of a sentence that read, I hope they understand my decision. His mind raced. What decision, and who was meant to understand it? The fragments revealed only hints, leaving much to the imagination. That was what made it both frustrating and captivating. Each piece was a small revelation, but the whole picture remained hidden. James realized he would need more than just observation and patience. He needed context. He began thinking about Prince Harry's recent activities, public appearances, and the quiet moments that James had occasionally noticed from a distance. He remembered how the prince had seemed thoughtful in private meetings, occasionally pausing to look out of a window as though weighing choices in his mind. Perhaps this letter reflected those moments, the private reflections that no one else could see. He took a deep breath and began to reconstruct the fragments with renewed focus. This time, he tried to match not only the edges of the paper, but also the tone of the sentences. A few pieces contained parts of words that could belong to more than one sentence. James carefully considered each possibility, sometimes trying a fragment in multiple positions until it felt right. It was a slow, almost meditative process. Hours passed as he worked quietly, surrounded by the soft hum of the palace and the faint rustle of the paper in his hands. While working, James began to notice patterns in the writing. Certain phrases appeared more than once, such as, I cannot ignore and my responsibility. The repetition suggested that the writer was struggling with a significant choice, something weighing heavily on their mind. James felt a growing sense of empathy. He had always admired the prince from a distance, but now, as he pieced together these fragments, he began to understand the human side of the man, the doubts, fears, and considerations that rarely reached the public eye. At one point, James realized he had found the start of the letter. A small fragment contained the words, To those who care for me. He paused, carefully aligning it with the other pieces. It seemed to be the opening, the part where the writer addressed the intended reader. The phrase gave him hope that he was making progress. He carefully marked the position and continued piecing together the surrounding fragments. By mid-morning, James had reconstructed about half of the letter. The sentences were fragmented but readable, hinting at the prince's struggles with his responsibilities, his hopes for understanding, and his personal reflections. James felt a mix of awe and nervousness. He realized that he was holding a message that was deeply private, something that the writer had chosen to destroy rather than leave vulnerable. The responsibility of piecing it together and keeping it safe was immense. Despite the challenge, James felt a sense of satisfaction. Each fragment he connected was like solving a small puzzle, revealing a tiny glimpse of a larger truth. He had become deeply invested in the story, not just as a guard on duty, but as a witness to a personal moment in history. The process was painstaking, but it was also strangely rewarding. Every small success, every sentence he reconstructed, strengthened his determination to uncover the full message. Yet the task was not without tension. Some fragments were missing entirely, leaving gaps in the text. James stared at the empty spaces, imagining what words might have belonged there. He considered the possibility that someone had deliberately removed these pieces, perhaps to protect the prince's privacy. The thought made him more cautious. He knew that if anyone discovered what he was doing, it could cause a scandal, or at the very least, put him in serious trouble. Despite these concerns, James pressed on. He decided to document every fragment, even the smallest ones. He made sketches of the shapes, noted the handwriting style, and recorded partial words and sentences. By doing this, he hoped to have a reference that could help him reconstruct the missing parts later. He worked methodically, treating each piece with care and respect. As he worked, he began to notice subtle details that others might overlook. One fragment had a small crease, as if it had been folded repeatedly. Another contained a faint mark from a coffee cup, suggesting the letter had been written over multiple sittings. James imagined Prince Harry sitting at a desk, writing, pausing, and then returning to the letter hours later. The image made the guard smile quietly. It reminded him that behind the formal titles and duties, there was a person thinking and feeling just like anyone else. By the afternoon, James had made significant progress. He had connected several large fragments, revealing sentences that spoke of concern for family, the weight of expectations, and hopes for understanding. The letter was beginning to take shape, though key pieces remained missing. James felt both excitement and frustration. He was close to uncovering more, but the final pieces, the ones that would complete the puzzle, were elusive. Determined not to give up, James decided to review the palace archives and records he was allowed to access. While he could not see private documents, he could observe certain details. When the prince had been in certain rooms, what meetings had taken place, and what staff members had access to specific areas. This information might help him figure out where the missing fragments could be or how they had ended up shredded. Hours passed as he worked, and the palace slowly came alive with activity. Staff members moved quietly in the corridors, attending to their duties. James remained at his table, focused on the fragments, occasionally glancing up to ensure no one approached. The sense of urgency grew stronger as he realized that time was a factor. If anyone discovered the fragments before he could secure them, all of his careful work could be lost. As evening approached, James finally placed the last fragment he had found into position. It was a small piece, but it completed a sentence that made him pause. The words were simple yet powerful. "I hope they see me as more than a title, as more than a duty." James felt a lump in his throat. He understood, perhaps more than anyone else, the depth of the message. It was personal, vulnerable, and human. He leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The process of piecing together the shredded letter had been long, exhausting, and emotionally intense. Yet James felt a profound sense of connection with the writer. He realized that what he was doing was not just about solving a puzzle. It was about honoring someone's trust, even unknowingly, and preserving a piece of personal history. James carefully gathered all the reconstructed fragments, keeping them flat and intact. He knew that the next steps would be even more challenging. The letter was not complete, some pieces were still missing. But he had made significant progress and he felt a quiet confidence. He had proven to himself that patience, attention to detail, and dedication could overcome even the most difficult challenges. As he prepared to leave the office, James glanced around the quiet room. He felt a mixture of pride, curiosity, and anticipation. The puzzle was not finished, but he was closer than ever to understanding the full story. And though he did not know what lay ahead, he was determined to see it through, piece by piece, until the letter was fully restored. Walking through the palace corridors, James reflected on the extraordinary nature of his night. An ordinary guard, performing an ordinary duty, had stumbled upon something extraordinary. The fragments of a private letter, once thought lost, were slowly revealing a story that no one outside the palace might ever know. And James understood in that quiet moment that he was no longer just a guard. He was a part of the story, a silent witness to a secret that could change the way the world saw the prince. The next morning, James returned to the palace office with a quiet determination. The fragments of the letter sat neatly arranged on the table, waiting for him. He had spent the night thinking about the pieces, imagining what the missing fragments might contain. The more he considered it, the more he realized that this letter was not simply a note of ordinary matters. It was personal, revealing feelings and thoughts that no one outside the palace was meant to see. The idea that he could reconstruct it, piece by piece, filled him with both excitement and nervous responsibility. James began carefully examining the fragments again, looking for subtle clues he might have missed before. A small smudge on one corner of a piece caught his attention. He studied it under the soft light of the lamp, noticing that it looked like a fingerprint or perhaps a mark left by a ring. He wondered who had touched the letter and how it had come to be shredded in the first place. Had someone deliberately destroyed it, or had it been an accident? The questions added a layer of mystery, making the task even more intriguing. As he connected the fragments, sentences started to form more clearly. The words spoke of inner struggles, responsibilities, and personal hopes. James felt a deep empathy for the writer. He imagined Prince Harry sitting alone at a desk late at night, pen in hand, pouring out thoughts that could not be shared publicly. The vulnerability in the words was striking. It reminded James that behind the public image of a prince, there was a human being with doubts, emotions, and fears. One fragment contained a phrase that made James pause. "I fear that my choices may hurt those I care for." He repeated the words silently, feeling the weight behind them. It was not just a letter. It was a confession, a window into someone's private thoughts. James realized that he had become more than a guard that day. He had become a witness to a personal struggle, someone who was piecing together not just paper, but feelings and intentions. Hours passed as James carefully aligned each fragment, testing how words fit together. Some pieces had to be rotated multiple times, and some sentences had to be imagined before he could confirm the correct position. It was a slow, meticulous process, but it was also rewarding. Every successful connection felt like a small victory. Each sentence reconstructed revealed more about the writer's state of mind, giving James insight into the emotional depth of the message. While piecing the letter together, James began to notice subtle repetitions in the writing. Certain phrases appeared more than once, emphasizing the writer's anxiety and hope. "I hope they understand," and "I cannot ignore my responsibility" were phrases that appeared repeatedly. It was as if the writer was speaking to themselves while also addressing someone else, attempting to make sense of their own feelings. James found himself deeply moved by the honesty in the words. At one point, he discovered a fragment that contained a part of a sentence that had been partially hidden by a crease. "The path I must take is not easy." He held it up to the light, turning it slowly until it fit with the surrounding fragments. The words spoke of struggle, decision-making, and duty. James felt a growing respect for the writer. He could imagine the pressure and thought that had gone into writing the letter, the late nights, the contemplation, and the careful choice of every word. As the day progressed, James began to piece together a larger portion of the letter. The sentences revealed concerns about family, personal responsibility, and hopes that decisions would be understood by those affected. The tone was both serious and tender, reflecting deep reflection. James realized that he was witnessing the human side of royalty, a perspective rarely shared publicly. This realization made him feel honored, yet also cautious. He understood the delicate nature of the information and knew he could not let it fall into the wrong hands. Despite his progress, there were still missing fragments. Gaps remained, leaving some sentences incomplete. James stared at the empty spaces, imagining what words might fill them. His mind raced with possibilities, trying to connect the pieces not just physically, but emotionally. He understood the writer's intent and tone, and he used this understanding to make educated guesses about the missing parts. It was a delicate balance between interpretation and accuracy, and James approached it with care. While working, he became aware of the palace's rhythm. Staff members moved in and out of nearby rooms, conducting their duties quietly, oblivious to the delicate reconstruction taking place in the office. James remained focused, occasionally pausing to ensure that no one had noticed him. The secrecy of his task added a layer of tension. If anyone discovered what he was doing, it could create a situation he was not prepared to handle. He reminded himself that discretion was just as important as accuracy. By late afternoon, James had reconstructed most of the letter. The sentences were forming a coherent message, revealing a struggle with duty, personal reflection, and hope for understanding. One fragment in particular revealed the writer's inner conflict. "I feel torn between what is expected and what my heart truly desires." James paused, feeling the weight of the words. They spoke of a universal struggle, the tension between obligation and personal desire, something that anyone could relate to. The guard took a short break, sitting back in his chair and reflecting on the task he had undertaken. He realized that the process of piecing the letter together had changed him in subtle ways. He felt more empathetic, more aware of the complexities of human emotion, and more responsible for the trust placed in him, even unknowingly. This was more than a puzzle. It was a lesson in patience, care, and the value of discretion. As evening approached, James turned his attention to the final fragments he had yet to place. These pieces were smaller and more challenging, containing partial words or phrases that were difficult to interpret. He examined each one carefully, comparing handwriting, paper texture, and even the small marks left by folds or smudges. Slowly, methodically, he began to fit the pieces together. Each fragment that found its place brought him closer to completing the letter. Finally, as night fell over the palace, James managed to reconstruct nearly all of the letter. The message was becoming clear. The writer was deeply concerned about the impact of their decisions on family, aware of the responsibilities of their position, and hopeful that those affected would understand the intentions behind their choices. The letter was personal, heartfelt, and reflective, revealing a side of the writer that few would ever see. James felt a sense of quiet accomplishment. He had spent hours carefully analyzing, testing, and assembling the fragments. The letter was no longer just torn pieces of paper. It was a message, a story, a window into someone's thoughts and emotions. He realized that this was a rare experience, one that few could ever imagine. The sense of connection he felt to the writer was profound, even though he knew that the words were not meant for him personally. Yet, even with most of the letter reconstructed, one fragment still eluded him. A small piece was missing, and without it the message could not be fully understood. James knew he would have to search carefully, considering where it might have been misplaced or overlooked. The thought of completing the puzzle drove him forward, giving him renewed determination. He understood that the final piece was crucial, not just for accuracy, but for understanding the full intent of the writer. As he prepared to continue the search, James reflected on the journey so far. What had begun as an ordinary night of guarding, the palace had turned into an extraordinary challenge. He had discovered a hidden secret, pieced together a personal message, and gained insight into the inner world of a member of the royal family. The experience had tested his patience, focus, and discretion, but it had also given him a unique connection to history, a story unfolding in fragments that only he could piece together. James carefully stored the fragments he had reconstructed, ensuring they remained intact for the next stage of the process. He felt a quiet pride, knowing that he had handled the task with care and respect. Yet he also felt anticipation and curiosity, wondering what the missing fragment would reveal and what the complete letter might ultimately say. The night ahead promised new discoveries, and James was ready to face them, committed to solving the puzzle fully, piece by piece. Walking through the quiet corridors, James reflected on the extraordinary nature of the task before him. He was not just a guard, he was a participant in a story that few could ever witness. The fragments of the letter represented more than words. They represented trust, vulnerability, and a glimpse into a personal moment that would otherwise have remained hidden. James understood the significance of his role and felt a quiet determination to see the puzzle through to the end. Knowing that the final piece could reveal a truth that would make all his effort worthwhile, James walked through the palace corridors with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The envelope containing the fully reconstructed letter rested securely in his hands. What had started as a routine evening of guarding, the palace had turned into an extraordinary journey. He had uncovered a secret, pieced together a personal message, and preserved something deeply private and important. Every step he took reminded him of the responsibility he now carried, not only to protect the letter, but also to honor the trust embedded in the words it contained. The palace was quieter than usual that evening. Most staff had retired to their private quarters, leaving only a few key members moving about in hushed tones. James's experience over the past days had taught him to be cautious and patient. He had observed how secrets in the palace could travel fast if mishandled, and he knew that discretion was as important as the physical act of protecting the letter. He could not risk even a hint of carelessness. He reached the secure office where such sensitive matters were usually handled. The senior staff responsible for personal communications within the royal household would be the proper recipients of the letter. James carefully handed over the envelope, explaining in precise and professional terms that it contained a reconstructed message that had been found shredded. The staff received it with a mix of curiosity and respect, recognizing the effort James had put into restoring something so delicate. After turning over the envelope, James stepped back and allowed himself a moment of reflection. For days, he had been consumed by the task of piecing together the fragments, imagining the writer's intentions, and carefully reconstructing the sentences. He had spent hours thinking about each word, each pause, and the emotion behind the writing. Now, with the letter safely in trusted hands, he felt a quiet sense of completion. Yet, he also felt a lingering connection to the message. As he walked back through the corridors, James thought about the journey that had brought him here. The letter had revealed private thoughts, concerns, and reflections, things that rarely, if ever, reached the public. He realized how extraordinary it was to witness such vulnerability. For a moment, he imagined the writer sitting alone, pen in hand, pouring out feelings that had been carefully shielded from the world. He understood the courage it must have taken to write such words and the reasons behind the decision to shred the original letter. James also reflected on the lessons he had learned from the experience. Patience had been essential. Each fragment required careful observation and attention to detail. Any mistake could have damaged the letter or disrupted the reconstruction process. Focus had been equally important. He had to block out distractions and work steadily, allowing the pieces to come together over time. And above all, discretion was vital. He had witnessed a personal story that was not meant for casual sharing, and he had to respect that trust. As he made his way to the guards' quarters, James thought about how the experience had changed him. He had always taken pride in his duty, but now he felt a deeper understanding of responsibility. Protecting the palace was no longer just about maintaining order and security. It was about safeguarding history, trust, and personal stories. He had realized that even the smallest acts could have profound significance. That night, James sat quietly in his quarters, reflecting on the journey. He could still see the fragments in his mind, the delicate edges, and the carefully reconstructed sentences. Each one told a story of thoughtfulness, care, and reflection. He thought about the moment he had discovered the shredded pieces and how quickly his life had shifted from routine duty to extraordinary responsibility. It had been challenging, but it had also been deeply rewarding. He smiled quietly to himself, realizing how rare and unique the experience had been. Few people could ever imagine holding such a message in their hands, reconstructing it piece by piece, and preserving it with care. He felt proud, not in a boastful way, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had done something meaningful. He had been entrusted, albeit unknowingly, with a story that reflected honesty, vulnerability, and thoughtfulness. The next day, James returned to his usual guard duties. The palace seemed the same at first glance, the same corridors, the same doors, the same ceremonial routines. But for James, everything felt different. He walked with a quiet confidence, aware of the extraordinary events he had been part of. In the midst of routine duties, he carried a story in his mind, a memory of discovery and careful reconstruction that no one else would know in its entirety. He occasionally thought about the letter and what it represented. It was more than words on paper. It was a window into the writer's private thoughts and emotions. It revealed struggles, hopes, and reflections that were rarely, if ever, shared. James felt honored to have been a part of that process, to have witnessed something so personal, and to have ensured that it remained protected. It reminded him that even in a role that seemed ordinary, extraordinary moments could occur if one approached their duties with care, attention, and empathy. In the days that followed, James noticed subtle changes in himself. He was more observant, more thoughtful, and more patient. The experience had given him a deeper appreciation for the value of trust and discretion. He understood that the things people consider private are often deeply meaningful, and that protecting such moments requires diligence, empathy, and integrity. These lessons would stay with him long after the events of the shredded letter had passed. Occasionally, James would recall the exact moment he had found the fragments, scattered like tiny pieces of a puzzle waiting to be discovered. The excitement he had felt, the careful handling of each piece, and the gradual reconstruction of the message were moments etched clearly in his memory. He realized that what he had done was more than solving a puzzle. It had been a journey of understanding human emotion, empathy, and trust. As the months went by, James continued his work at the palace, carrying out his duties with quiet dedication. The reconstructed letter remained safely stored in the proper channels, a piece of history preserved with care. He never revealed the full story to anyone outside the palace, understanding that the trust embedded in the words was not his to share. Yet he carried the memory with him, a reminder of the extraordinary responsibility and privilege he had been given. One evening, as he walked the familiar corridors, James paused near the office where he had first laid out the fragments. He could still see the soft light, the careful arrangement of pieces, and the moment when the puzzle began to take shape. The memory brought a quiet smile to his face. It was a story that no one else would know in its entirety, but for James it remained vivid, a reminder of patience, careful observation, and the value of safeguarding what is entrusted to us. James understood that life often presents unexpected challenges. What begins as a routine day may transform into something extraordinary if one approaches it with care and attention. The shredded letter, once lost and incomplete, had become a story of perseverance, thoughtfulness, and careful reconstruction. And though he had not been the writer, he had become a part of the story, a silent witness to something deeply private and meaningful. Looking back, James realized that this experience had taught him more than he could have imagined. It had shown him the value of patience, the importance of discretion, and the profound impact of empathy. He understood that his ordinary role as a guard had allowed him to witness something extraordinary, and that even small actions, careful observation, attention to detail, and respect for privacy could make a significant difference. The letter had been completed, preserved, and protected, but its story had left a lasting impression on James. It had connected him, in a small but meaningful way, to the human side of royalty, the reflections, concerns, and hopes that often remain hidden from the world. And though he would continue his duties quietly, moving through the palace halls with professionalism and care, he knew that he had been part of something remarkable, a story of trust, patience, and human connection that he would carry with him forever. As the palace settled into another quiet night, James paused at a window, looking out over the grounds. He felt a sense of fulfillment, a quiet pride in knowing that he had played a role in preserving something meaningful. The fragments once lost and torn had become whole again, and with them, a story of trust, vulnerability, and thoughtful reflection had been protected. James smiled to himself, knowing that even in the ordinary, extraordinary moments can happen, and that he had been lucky enough to witness one. And in that peaceful moment, James understood that the journey was more than just about reconstructing a letter. It was about patience, empathy, and the responsibility we carry when entrusted with something valuable. He had learned that sometimes the smallest roles can lead to the most meaningful experiences. And as he turned to continue his patrol, he felt a quiet certainty. He had not only preserved a piece of history, but he had also grown in ways that would remain with him forever. If you want, I can continue with Part 4 next, keeping the suspense and emotional depth while leading to the resolution of the mystery. Do you want me to proceed with Part 4? Part 4, Co-Expand Crow without heading 1,300 words in simple English words. It should be interesting, and every part should be engaging so the audience doesn't get bored. And don't use any violated word. Aviate any violated content absolutely. Here's Part 4 expanded to around 1,300 words in simple, engaging third-person English, continuing the story with suspense, emotion, and tension. The morning air in the palace was crisp, and James felt a quiet sense of purpose as he walked toward the small office where the letter fragments had been carefully laid out. The events of the previous day had left him exhausted but determined. He had reconstructed most of the shredded letter, but one piece still remained missing, the fragment that could complete the message and reveal the full thoughts of the writer. That fragment had become an obsession for him, a puzzle he could not rest until he solved. James carefully placed the reconstructed fragments on the table, taking a moment to study them as a whole. The sentences revealed the writer's deep concern about responsibilities, personal reflections, and hopes for understanding. It was clear that the letter was meant to explain decisions, express emotions, and perhaps seek reconciliation. But the missing piece made the meaning incomplete, leaving gaps that James could not ignore. He knew he needed to find it. He began his search methodically, retracing his steps from the previous day. He thought about where he had first discovered the shredded fragments and considered where the missing piece could have fallen. The palace was vast, with countless corridors, offices, and hidden spaces. But James's experience as a guard had given him knowledge of even the smallest details. He checked behind furniture, under desks, and even inside drawers that might have been overlooked. Each search brought him closer, yet the fragment remained elusive. As he continued, James realized that this missing piece was not just another fragment of paper. It was the key to understanding the complete message. The words he had already reconstructed hinted at decisions that were difficult and personal, but without the final piece, the intent and emotion remained unclear. He felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Every second spent searching was a step toward uncovering the truth, yet he had to remain patient and careful. Hours passed, and James's search took him to areas of the palace he rarely visited. He paused often to listen, ensuring that no one approached. The palace was alive with activity now, staff moving silently, footsteps echoing across polished floors. But he remained focused on his task. His hands moved carefully, lifting papers, checking drawers, and scanning every surface. He was determined not to overlook even the smallest clue. Finally, as he approached a rarely used side office, James noticed something unusual near the corner of a desk. A small piece of paper peeked out from beneath the carpet's edge. His heart leapt. Carefully, he reached down and retrieved it. It was the missing fragment, the final piece that would complete the puzzle. James examined it under the light, seeing the familiar handwriting and the partial words that would fill the remaining gap. He felt a surge of relief and excitement. With the fragment in hand, James returned to the main office and carefully aligned it with the reconstructed pieces. Slowly, deliberately, he placed it in position. The sentences now flowed completely, revealing a coherent and deeply personal message. James leaned back, reading the full letter from start to finish. The words expressed concern, responsibility, and hope. They revealed struggles with duty, reflection on decisions, and the desire to be understood by those closest to the writer. The letter was heartfelt and honest, a glimpse into emotions that rarely reach the public eye. James felt a profound sense of connection as he read. The letter spoke of challenges, doubts, and hopes for understanding, emotions that anyone could relate to. Yet it also reflected the unique responsibilities of someone in a position of public attention and duty. The tone was respectful, thoughtful, and deeply sincere. As he absorbed the message, James realized that he had become more than a guard. He had become a custodian of a private truth, entrusted with a story that few would ever know. The process of reconstructing the letter had changed him. He had learned patience, attention to detail, and the importance of discretion. But more than that, he had gained empathy for the writer. James could imagine the effort, thought, and care that had gone into every word, every sentence, and every decision to shred the original letter. He understood why the fragments had been hidden and why the complete message was meant to be private. As evening approached, James carefully placed the reconstructed letter in a safe folder, ensuring that it would remain protected. He reflected on the extraordinary events of the past days. What had begun as a routine guard duty had transformed into a delicate mission of discovery and preservation. He had pieced together a private message, uncovered personal thoughts, and preserved them with care. The responsibility weighed heavily, but it also gave him a quiet pride. James understood that the letter held not only personal significance, but also historical value. In time, it could provide insight into the writer's thoughts, decisions, and experiences during a unique moment in history. The realization made him more cautious than ever. He knew that sharing the letter indiscriminately could cause misunderstanding or misinterpretation. His role was not to judge, but to protect and preserve. That night, James sat quietly in the office, reading the letter once more. Each sentence revealed more layers of emotion, more depth to the writer's reflections. He was struck by the honesty and vulnerability expressed in words that few would ever see. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the writer reading the completed letter as well, perhaps hoping that someone would understand. The thought reminded him that trust, even unspoken, could connect people across different positions and roles. James knew the final challenge was yet to come. He had completed the reconstruction, but now he had to decide what to do with the letter. He could leave it in a secure location for senior staff, or he could personally deliver it to someone responsible for safeguarding such personal messages. The choice required careful thought. He weighed the options, considering the palace protocols, the importance of discretion, and the potential impact of the letter being seen by the wrong person. After careful consideration, James decided to follow palace procedure. He would ensure that the letter reached the appropriate hands without risking exposure. The process required patience and precision, as well as a steady mind. He gathered the letter fragments, now complete and restored, and carefully placed them in a secure envelope. Every movement was deliberate, every precaution taken to protect the integrity of the message. As he walked through the quiet corridors, James felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The letter, once shredded and incomplete, was now whole. He had succeeded in his mission, but he understood that the story did not end with reconstruction. The letter's contents would remain private, preserved for those who needed to understand its significance. And in that quiet moment, James realized the extraordinary role he had played, not just as a guard, but as a silent witness, a preserver of history and a protector of trust. That evening, as the palace lights glowed softly and the corridors emptied once more, James took a deep breath. The task that had begun as a simple discovery had transformed into a profound journey. He had uncovered a private message, solved a delicate puzzle, and preserved a piece of personal history with care and respect. The experience had tested his patience, focus, and discretion, but it had also provided a unique connection to a story that few could ever witness. He placed the envelope containing the complete letter in a secure location, knowing that it would be handled appropriately. For James, the sense of accomplishment was quiet but deep. He had not only reconstructed the letter, but had also learned the value of empathy, care, and responsibility. And though no one else would know the full story, he felt a profound satisfaction in having played a role in preserving a message that reflected honesty, reflection, and trust. As he left the office, James glanced at the quiet corridors once more. He realized that he had experienced something extraordinary. An ordinary night of guarding, the palace had transformed into a journey of discovery, patience, and connection. The letter, now whole, represented more than words on paper. It represented trust, vulnerability, and the delicate balance of duty and personal reflection. And James knew that, in a small but meaningful way, he had become part of that story, a silent witness to a private moment that few would ever see.